Well, earlier this week, the National Bureau of Statistics, the NBS, released the 2023 second quarter report on capital importation in Nigeria. Well, the capital importation report is a vital document that reflects the state of investment that comes to Nigeria. Jide Ogunsanwo, founder of Leadership by Data and Channels Television's data consultant, is here to share more insights about Nigeria's capital importation performance. Thank you very much, Jide, for joining us on the news at 10.
Good evening, Anne.
Now, what does the data from the latest investment capital report for the National Bureau of Statistics mean? What is the revelation we're getting from this data?
It depends on how you want to look at it. What the National Bureau of Statistics has done is to release a report for the second quarter of the year. I'm talking about April, May, June. So that's one way to look at it. We could also look at it from the year-to-date perspective, which is January to June. It gives us different information. If you look at it from the second quarter perspective, and that's April to June, what you will notice is the National Bureau of Statistics is telling us that in the second quarter of the year, capital imported into Nigeria, $1 billion. However, if we compare that to the second quarter, same period of last year, it was $1.5 billion. So on a quarter-by-quarter perspective, quarter this year versus the same quarter last year, capital importation into Nigeria is down by approximately 33%. That's if we look at it from a quarterly perspective. But Anne, a more stable perspective to look at it is if we look at it from January to June. And if we take a look at exactly what has happened from January to June, not just January to June this year, previous years, it will allow us to clearly understand the challenges, the opportunities, and the dangers. On a half-year perspective, January to June, the information shows that capital imported into Nigeria, January to June, first half of this year, $2.1 billion. This is only the second time in a decade when capital importation into Nigeria in the first half of the year will be either $2.1 billion or less. The last time in the first half of the year when capital importation was only lower than $2.1 billion was way back in 2016 when capital importation was only $1.7 billion. So in simple terms, if we compare what has happened with regards to money coming into Nigeria from outside the country, first half of 2022 was better, first half of 2021 was better, first half of 2020 was better. Going back 2019, 2018, 2017, the only time when capital importation has been worse than what it was this year was during the first half of 2016. You know what, in one way to summarize this is to understand that what this means is compared to, if we look at that big number in 2019 when we had capital importation of in excess of $14 billion in the first half of the year, it simply means that the amount of money that came into Nigeria on a daily basis in the first half of 2019 is the amount of money that now comes into Nigeria in a week. Again, you heard that clearly. In 2019, on an average, the amount of money that comes into Nigeria on a daily is what now comes into Nigeria on a weekly. That is the information from the National Bureau of Statistics.
But Jide, how do investors, especially, of course, external investors, perceive investing in Nigeria? Anyone will want to ask, do business return outweigh the risks?
It depends on the sectors. There are several sectors in Nigeria. Yes, indeed, the business returns outweigh the risks. But the challenges Nigeria faces isn't peculiar to Nigeria. Based on the United Nations report, they say Africa has a challenge, and I'll explain. In 2021, capital imported into all African countries in 2021 and $80 billion. 2021, capital imported into Africa, $80 billion. However, last year, 2022, based on the report from the United Nations, capital imported into Africa has dropped by almost half, only $45 billion. And so it's not a Nigerian problem, it's an African problem because investors are concerned that the world might see another recession. Investors are concerned about how easy will it be for them to get their money out if they invest. And investors also see Africa and they see a lot of policy uncertainties with respect to how governance changes. And if we even take a look at the numbers shows what investors are worried about. And if we take a look at that critical portion of capital importation, I'm talking about foreign direct investment. What we see is in the first half of this year, that critical portion of capital importation, foreign direct investment, first half of this year into Nigeria, $134 million. And however, that is the lowest foreign direct investment into Nigeria in the first half of the year in more than 10 years. Look at the first half of 2014 into Nigeria. Capital importation in excess of $950 million, approaching that 1 billion mark in the first half of 2014. Now, first half of 2023, $134 million. In simple terms, Nigeria of before is different from Nigeria of today. And if money isn't coming in from the global financial players, especially the United Kingdom and the United States, it will affect the prospects of job creation, it will affect the prospects of growth and development. The summary from this report, especially foreign direct investment, is that Nigeria, as well as other African countries, have to now be more creative, more innovative about how they can use savings of citizens to be able to channel growth and prosperity for its citizens.
Okay, so what is the outlook for capital importation in Nigeria? Let's talk about the future now. In the last quarter of this year, what is the outlook looking like?
So, last quarter of the year, October to December, we're already in October. There are several ways to predict the future, and it's not easy. But one simple way to look at what will happen in this last quarter is to look at what has happened in previous last quarters, especially in the last 5 years. It will give us an indication of what might happen in the next days of this year. And if we take a look at how capital has been distributed over the last 5 years, here's what you notice. In 2018, for instance, $16.8 billion came into Nigeria. Most of that money came in the first quarter. The least came in the fourth quarter, only 13%. Same thing happened in 2019 and 2020. Most of the capital comes in the first quarter of the year. The least comes in the last quarter of the year. In 2021, it was slightly different. Most of that money came into Nigeria in the fourth quarter. But what happened again last year? Most of the money comes in the first quarter, very little comes in the last quarter. So, Anne, the summary is, in the last 5 years, 4 out of those 5 years, most of the money comes into Nigeria in the first quarter of the year, and very little comes in the last quarter. If going by that history and if that record continues, then the next days for the rest of this year, we shouldn't really expect much.
All right, Baba Jide Ogunsanwo, we always hope for positive things to happen.
Oh, no,
that's great.
The future is bright. The future has to be bright. Probably even brighter than you, brighter than your smile.
Okay, thank you very much, Baba Jide Ogunsanwo, founder of Leadership by Data and Channels Television's data consultant. Thank you for your insight.
Pleasure is all mine.
On the news at 10.